Hello and welcome to another episode of Worm Take Wednesdays with Dr. Alex. Thank you for your patience waiting for another episode. Try to get them out weekly, but at the moment life is lifing, so I appreciate you hanging in there. So today I really want to talk about gender ideology. Why do I want to talk about it? Well, funnily enough, it's a word that we've all seen thrown around in the media quite a bit lately. And it's usually talked about in relation to transgender identities and other words that sometimes are come together with this discussion of gender ideology are words like social contagion and the idea that there is a social contagion of young people, almost like transgender people have a secret agenda to recruit more and more people amongst our ranks. So is there really a gender ideology that is spreading transness all over the land, or is there maybe something else at play? Let's talk about it. Well, before we get into gender ideology specifically, I really want to take a moment to define what does the word ideology means, right? It's not just about any ideas, it's a specific word with a specific meaning. So according to the Cambridge Dictionary, an ideology is a theory or set of beliefs, especially one on which a political system, party, or organization is based. So it's a theory or set of beliefs. So is there a theory or set of beliefs about gender? Well, absolutely there is. But before we get into that, I also want to make it clear that when we're talking about gender ideology or any ideology, we're not talking about people's individual identities. And in the case of gender ideology, we're not talking about individual gender identities. We're talking about ideology because ideologies is larger than individual identities. It's about a theory or set of beliefs, like I just said. And why am I saying that? It's because sometimes certain words, like for example, cisgender, some people have started to say that to talk about cisgender people as cisgender is a slur or is something that cisgender people have not chosen for themselves. So first of all, I want to address what does trans and cis even mean in case you've seen those words but you're not sure what they mean or where they come from. Both transgender and cisgender have Latin prefixes, trans and cis respectively. You also see them used in science, and all that trans mean is across from, and cis means on the same side as. So when we're talking about transgender people, is people whose gender identity is somewhere else than their gender assigned at birth. And when we're talking about cisgender people, all that it means is that their gender identity aligns with their gender that they were assigned at birth. And the reason why the word cisgender was created was really to challenge the idea that any one gender identity is better or worse than the other. And this is actually going to be relevant to what we're going to talk about today. So I kind of wanted to start from there. So it's not better or worse to be cisgender or to be transgender. Really, my desire is that we all live in a liberated world where we can all be whichever gender identity we want or we don't want. There are some people who are agender, right? They don't identify with the idea of gender at all. And that everybody can express their gender as freely as they want. So this is not about one gender identity being better or worse than the other. Like I said, this is actually not about individual identities at all. It's about ideology, a theory or set of beliefs. So let's go back to the topic. Is there such a thing as gender ideology? Well, in dominant culture in the so-called United States, I believe there is a gender ideology at play, but it might not be what you think, or maybe it's exactly what you think. I don't know who you are, dear viewer or listener. And so I posit to you in this video today that actually cisgenderism is the dominant gender ideology in the so-called US and in many other Western countries as well. So what do I mean by cisgenderism? What is cisgenderism? Again, this is not about individuals. It's not about individual cisgender people. It's about systems. It's about theory. It's about ideology. So the term cisgenderism as an ideology is really first used by scholars Ansara and Peter Hegarty. And this is how they define cisgenderism. a prejudicial ideology rather than an individual attitude that is systemic, multi-level, and reflected in authoritative cultural discourse. Cisgenderism problematizes the categorical distinction itself between classes of people as either transgender or cisgender, or as gender variant or marked. We consider cisgenderism to be a form of othering that takes people categorized as transgender as they fact to be explained. That's pretty heady, but I really wanted to give you the definition of cisgenderism as Gavi Ansara and Peter Hegarty talk about and have talked about it for well over a decade. So this is not a new idea. It's been around a minute or two or 5 or over 10 years, like I just said. Okay, so let's go back to this idea of cisgenderism. What does that mean in practice? What does it mean when Peter and Gavi talk about systemic, multi-level, and that's reflected in the cultural discourse? So let's really think about it in practice. So what that means in practice is that cisgenderism as a theory, as an assumption that the baseline for humanity is to be cisgender. So to have a gender identity that is aligned with one's gender assigned at birth. And that means that folks who are transgender, non-binary, gender expansive, two-spirit, depending on definition of two-spirit that people might use for themselves, really deviate from this norm. And as such, are a phenomenon to be studied at the very least, or at the worst, they're really defined as having a mental disorder, in air quotes, of some kind, right? Because if the baseline is to be cisgender, so to have a gender identity that is aligned with our gender assigned at birth, then anything that deviates from the norm is deviant, in air quotes, right? Is different from the norm. And we see that in a lot of ways. For example, when a baby is born, right? We assume that the baby is cisgender unless they tell us otherwise later in life, right? And that's really interesting too, because often one of the things that I hear when working with younger folks is that, well, how can a child know that they're trans when they're like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years old or even 12 years old? Are they not mature enough? And yet we never ask ourselves, how does a cisgender child know at 5 or 6 or 12 or 13 or 14 that they're cisgender? That is, that they're a boy or a girl, for example. How do they know, right? So when we apply common sense, we're starting to see maybe some gap in this ideology, right? But also it really makes it clear that there is an assumption that cisgender identities are the norm, and therefore they don't need to be questioned, they don't need to be studied, they don't need to be challenged. There is an entitlement to that identity, right? And an assumption that that is the baseline, that is what is natural in air quote or normal in air quote. I don't like to use either of those words in this context, but I really wanted to put across what I'm talking about, right? Whereas if somebody is trans, gender expansive, non-binary, two-spirit, within Western dominant Anglo culture, there's an assumption that they deviate from this norm, right? And this starts from birth onwards, and actually I would say even before babies are born. Often when people are pregnant, they get asked, oh, is it a boy or a girl, right? And we've seen that. That's kind of part of everyday life, right? But what does cisgenderism mean at its heart, right? It means that there is an assumption that if a baby is born with a vulva, for example, that baby is female, and if the baby is born with a penis, that baby is male. It seems like straightforward enough, right? But actually it's not really that straightforward, because attributing certain characteristics as inherently masculine or feminine, it's not necessarily the way we have always done things everywhere at all times, right? It's just a way that we are categorizing people in fairly modern times. There's so much more to say about this. In fact, I have so much to say about this that I wrote a book about rigid gender binaries as traumatic and as part of like colonial legacy. And if you want to read it, the book is called Gender Trauma, Healing Cultural, Social, and Historical Gender Trauma. And actually, I'm going to read a little bit from the very end of the book at the end of this video. Because I feel like it's really relevant, and honestly, I don't think I can say it as well as I did when I was writing the book a few years ago. But what does it mean? You know, people might be like, look, Alex, this is pretty straightforward. A baby's born with a vulva, that baby's a girl. A baby's born with a penis, that baby's a boy. What is the big deal, right? Well, the big deal is that it doesn't stop there, right? I was saying that cisgenderism is also attributing certain characteristics as inherently masculine or feminine. So, for example, we're going to start talking to those babies and then those toddlers and children and teenagers in ways that are different according to the gender that we perceive them to be. Because there are lots of ideas about what men should be like and what women should be like in our culture, right? And of course, these ideas, we know that they change across time with history. We know that they're dependent on social context. We know that they're dependent on familial context. But there are also some common denominators, right? So for example, in popular culture, often men are depicted as the stronger sex and women are depicted as the weaker sex. And we could say that that is not the case anymore because it's 2025, and I would challenge that that often is still the case. And we're also seeing a resurgence in the so-called US of the idea of like trad wife, for example, which, hey, if that's who you want to be, I love that for you. But if you're trying to impose that on everybody, then I've got questions. Like, when you're trying to impose that on everybody, it means that you truly believe that women have certain characteristics and men have certain other characteristics. And this is an idea that is very pervasive in popular culture. Think about how many millions of copies books like John Gray's Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus have sold. Or in the UK, I remember about 20 years or so ago, there was this show, Why Men Can't Iron and Women Can Read Maps, right? And there's a whole cadre of comedians who have made their fortune, usually cis white male comedian, on making jokes about the difference between men and women, right? And often men are seen as more dominant and aggressive, and naturally so. Here's that, in air quotes, here's that word again. And women as more passive and caring. And we could write this off as stereotypes, right? But the problem is that they're not just stereotypes. They are so pervasive, not just in popular culture, but in our society and in our culture in the West, that they also influence the way we manage the judicial system, for example. If there is a violent crime, if it's perpetrated by a woman is much more likely to receive a harsher sentence compared to a man. Why is that? Because it's seen as unnatural, in air quotes, that a woman that is supposed to be caring and nurturing would do something violent, or that is perceived as uncaring or not nurturing, or that it is not caring or nurturing, right? And of course there are some exceptions, but really those differences are not just stereotypes, are not just about, you know, aisles of pink clothes and aisles of blue clothes. It runs much, much deeper than that. And that's why we're talking about cisgenderism as in ideology, because it's a system that basically sips in every structure of our society, and it influences things that are as serious as the judicial system or the prison industrial complex or the educational system, and so on and so forth. So we're not just talking about, you know, sports or clothes or music or movies. We're really talking about very important aspects of our life and very important aspects of how systems work. And this ideology of cisgenderism, it's kind of housed under the much larger umbrella of biological determinism. And biological determinism, it's an ideology as well. And it's a set of beliefs, it's a theory that really tells us that certain biological characteristics are associated with psychological, emotional, and behavioral traits. So, for example, like I was saying, if women are perceived to be naturally, in air quote, caring and nurturing, that's because we're associating what we see as certain biological characteristics with psychological, emotional, and behavioral traits, right? And we've already talked a little bit about why this is problematic, but this is so problematic in so many ways and for so many reasons that go way beyond the scope of what I try to keep as shorter videos. So this cisgenderist ideology is housed under this bigger umbrella of biological determinism, and other things that are born out of biological determinism, for example, are things like ideas about IQ, intelligence quotients, right? Which we know are also like deeply racist, and generally biological determinism is very racist, very patriarchal. It's really not an ideology that is conducive to collective liberation, I would say. And cisgenderism is a manifestation of biological determinism, specifically in relation to gender. And of course, it also connects with race, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but I feel like that deserves like a whole episode to talk about as well. But I find that it's impossible to talk about gender without talking about also colonialism or the way we're racialized and so on. So this cisgenderist ideology is so pervasive that we see it pop up everywhere, from people being pregnant and being asked, is it a boy or a girl, to the different language that we use for boys and girls. Oh, look at that man, they're so handsome. Or, that boy is so strong. Look at that girl, she's so pretty. Look at her smile, It illuminates a room. It's pretty rare that people would say that boy's smile illuminates a room, right? But also expressions like boys will be boys and all the implications of that. I feel like I could probably do a whole episode just on the ideas of boys will be boys. And if you want me to do that episode, just tell me in the comments or let me know. Or the idea that, girls are cattier, right, with each other, or they're in competition with each other. And so it's reflected in our language, but it's also reflected in the way we organize almost everything, in the way we organize legislation, and also in the way we organize public access buildings. For example, the way we organize bathrooms. At home, we don't have men's bathroom and women's bathroom, but yet somehow when we go to public access building like government offices or, restaurants or airports, right? All of a sudden we find ourselves with women's bathrooms and men's bathroom. And traditionally, for example, certain things like diaper changing stations were only found in women's bathroom. Now you can find them in an increasing number of men's bathroom as well. But there's much larger issues at play. And again, that could be its own episode. I'm trying to really summarize something that is so much bigger than like the half hour, 40 minutes that I'm trying to keep those episodes to. But hopefully you're getting the gist of what I'm saying, right? And that kind of separation is not just in language, it's not just in the way we organize bathroom, but it's also in the way we organize sports, for example, or the way we separate kids in school. Oh, boys line up over there, girls line up over there. The kind of sports and activities that girls and boys might have access to, the way we separate girls and boys for things like sex education, for example, which also doesn't make a lot of sense because it's really helpful to know about sex education from every perspective, right? But again, there are a lot of assumptions being made about why we separate boys and girls, why we separate men and women in certain regards, right? And even clothes, there are clothes that are considered for men and clothes that are considered to be for women, right? There's often a little bit of an uproar if a man is wearing a skirt or a dress in a Western dominant culture, of course, right? And it impacts the way we look at people's mannerism, right? If somebody walks or talks or moves in a way that is not seen as congruent with the gender we perceive them to be, there can be some judgment around that, right? There can even be bullying and harassment. In fact, we know that there is often when people don't conform to certain gender ideals that are kind of embedded socially and culturally. And of course, like I said, those ideals do change across cultures, they do change across history. But it's this idea that there are ways to be a man and ways to be a woman. And even though there is a little space in each one of those categories, that space, it's not infinite. That space is finite and it's contained, right? And we see that in the workplace as well, right? Which kind of genders dominate which professions, right? Professions that are seen as more caring and nurturing, whether it's nursing or being a kindergarten teacher, are usually more dominated by women, even though, interestingly, when men enter those professions, they are usually, they go up the ladder of promotion much faster. That's the same in therapy, for example, which is more of a women-dominated industry, and yet often men find it faster to be promoted or to move into position of leadership soon after licensure. So all of those ideas of kind of who men are and who women are not just stereotypes. They're things that kind of permeate every aspect of our lives in ways that we may or may not notice, right? And they really soak into the culture, they soak into the language. I gave the example of handsome versus pretty, for example, but there are so many other things that we can think about when it comes to language. But they really kind of come into our lungs, and they're like the air that we breathe. And just like we're not aware of the air that we breathe at every breath, right? We breathe all the time. We breathe automatically. We do not always breathe intentionally. Sometimes we might breathe intentionally. In fact, I'm going to take a little intentional breath and a little sip of water right now. But they're so pervasive that just like those invisible, elements of air that we breathe in and out every day, we don't even notice it, right? And so cisgenderism does get into all aspects of our life, right? And some of you, as you're listening to this, might be thinking, but Alex, what about biology? Isn't sex different from gender? Okay, I can kind of get onto this concept of gender, the way you're talking about it, but what about sex, right? Sex is distinct. We're not talking about gender. What about sex, right? It's very clear from biology that there are men and women, right? Well, actually, it turns out that separating sex from gender is not as helpful as some of us initially thought. And in fact, sex is also not a binary. And biologists I've been talking about this for a long time, and in the episode description, there's a bunch of references and a bunch of articles. So if you want to check them out, please be my guest. There's like peer-reviewed papers in Nature about how sex is not binary, right? And also, as well as the fact that sex is not binary, when we separate sex from gender, it's actually kind of tricky. And that is tricky because the characteristics that we label as male or female are not inherently male or female. We have decided to call them male or female. So for example, there are no male hormones or female hormones. There are hormones. Some bodies are testosterone dominant and some bodies are estrogen dominant. And that actually can be changed. Actually, it also changes across the lifespan. Even cisgender people are not going to have a consistent level of testosterone and a consistent level of estrogen in their bodies throughout the lifespan. That's why there is like puberty and perimenopause and menopause and andropause, right? Our hormones do change and fluctuate. They are not static. And again, they're not male hormones or female hormones, they're hormones, right? So language and culture and social norms have meant that we have labeled some things as male or female, but they're not inherently male or female. So, for example, we call a penis male genitalia, but we've decided to call it male genitalia. It's not inherently in itself male genitalia. It's just genitalia, just like chromosomes are just chromosomes and hormones are just hormones. And at some point we decided not only that those things are inherently gendered, but that they are so important that they dictate all these other differences between us humans. And science has really challenged that. Like I already said, our hormones are so much more complex than we often think about. And honestly, just talk to a hormone researcher that works with humans for like 10 minutes, and you'll understand how complex hormones are and how even science doesn't quite fully understand how they work all the time. And chromosomes, similarly, right? We have found out more and more about chromosome and chromosomal makeup and how it is not quite as straightforward as we think it to be, right? Sometimes on social media, I see people going, well, you're either XX or XY. I was like, oh, so much more complicated than that. Again, check the references that I've put in the episode description. I know I've put a lot of references, but I feel like this is an important topic, and I want people to see there is such an abundance of peer-reviewed literature, and actually I had to kind of stop myself from putting more references. So, is it useful to distinguish sex from gender? A lot of us don't think so anymore. And believe me, I used to do that too. I used to say, sex is different from gender. I use words like natal sex or biological sex, and I don't do that anymore because I know better, right? Not only sex is in binary, but also this distinction between sexes and gender is very flimsy at the best, and maybe really unhelpful or even harmful at its worst. And some of you might be thinking, well, but what about those brain differences? Okay, fine. Hormones are complicated. Chromosomes are complicated. Maybe we don't want to gender bodies according to genitalia. But what about brain differences between men and women, right? Maybe that Channel 4 TV show, why men can't iron and women can read maps, was right. Actually, again, neuroscientists have proven more than once that brain differences between men and women at birth are actually much smaller than we think. And in fact, they're so small that differences between individuals, so between just different people, whether in the same gender categories or across gender categories, however we want to define gender in this moment, are greater than differences between men and women or boys and girls. But of course, like I was saying earlier, because we interact with boys and girls so differently throughout the lifespan, from when they're, in utero to when they're babies, and then all throughout the lifespan, we often refer to boys and girls and men and women in different ways. Those differences then are deepened and broadened by nurture. But in terms of nature, so to speak, those differences are pretty micro. And actually the differences between individual brains, much greater than gender differences. So given all of that, where does the cisgender ideologist even come from? Like, why do we even have it? If all of this is true, obviously don't take my word for it. That's why there's a lot of references in this episode description. Please educate yourself. I love it when people are curious and when I find out more and when I reflect on those things more. I love that for you, and I love that for us as humanity, right? So where does a cisgenderist ideology come from? Those of you who know my work, I think are going to be pretty not surprised by my answer. Colonialism. Colonialism has done and continues to do a real number on us as human, right? And part of colonialism, and there's so much more to say about this, so much that I wrote an entire book about it. Look at me, I'm getting so much better at promoting my own stuff. But seriously, gender trauma, don't take my word for it, as two awards. One from the Nautilus Award, the Gold Seal, in its category, and also from ASEC, the American Association for Sex Educator, Counselor, and Therapist, as Sexuality Professionals Book of the Year in 2023. And even though the book is written mostly for therapists, counselors, educators, I've written it in a way that I hope is pretty accessible to the general public. So cisgenderism, in a way, just like biological determinism, goes hand in hand and is deeply connected to colonialism. And in colonial practices and policies, we see, from the beginning, this, if we want to be benevolent, misunderstanding, but then I think the benevolence stops there because we see the degradation, erasure, and the violence towards gender expansive people. And we keep seeing it, right? If we think about the rates of missing and murdered Indigenous girls, women, and Two-Spirit folks, we can see very clearly the impact of colonialism and that systemic violence, which continues under the ongoing settler colonial project in the so-called US. And so, when we're thinking about a rigid gender binary and cisgenderist ideology as part of colonialism, some of you might think, but in some indigenous cultures, there are still gendered roles. And absolutely, I am not arguing with that in any way, shape, or form. But gender has not always been defined on the basis of biology. I'm going to say that again in case it's not clear. Gender was not always, and is not always in every context, defined by biology. But gender can also be defined through social, spiritual, interpersonal, and cultural lenses and cultural roles, right? And so the reality is that if we want to look at science, let's look at all the sciences, including history, which is its own science, social science, but still a science, right? And the reality is that people have always existed outside of rigid gender binary, what we would now call trans people or non-binary people, or if we want to use a more expansive term, gender expansive people, have always existed across time or space. So we do not, as humanity, exist within the confines of the strict cisgenderist rigid binaries of male and female. We just don't historically, right? And there's so much more to say on why cisgenderism is a colonial ideology and goes hand in hand with colonialism. And again, I am trying to make episodes that are not always an hour long, so bear with me. And if you want to learn more about this, please let me know, and I can always do more episodes. So as I was saying, the reality is that folks have always existed outside of this rigid gender binaries, and that has been the case across time and space. And of course, intersex people have always existed, which again really challenges this idea of separating sex from gender, but also this idea that there is a dimension that is binary somewhere, right? And I'm not trying to recruit anybody or convince the world that everybody should be trans. Honestly, especially right now, if you're not trans, you're safer, and if you're trans, it's not a great time, to be trans at the moment. And for a lot of people, it's never really been a great time. But what I'm trying to say is that don't be fooled by this idea that to just think that there are men and women and that that's how it's always been, and that to be trans is some newfangled modern idea, that is a lie. Gender expansive people, trans people, two-spirit people, folks outside rigid gender binaries, intersex people, we've always existed across time and space. And there is no agenda to make anybody trans who's not trans, despite what some people would have you believe through their scare tactics and the weaponization of people's fears, right? And the other reality is that the weaponization of fear is often telling folks that trans, non-binary, or gender expansive people are mentally ill, in air quotes, and as such we're dangerous, right? But the reality is that two-spirit folks, trans folks, non-binary folks, gender expansive people are much more likely to be experiencing violence than to enact violence. And the numbers, the statistics are very clear on this. And of course, often the people who are the receiving end of most of that violence, especially the more extreme violence, are trans feminine people and Black, Brown, Indigenous, and immigrant trans feminine people in particular, because of that combination of misogyny, transphobia, racism, xenophobia, and so on. So, while trans people are not out here trying to recruit anybody, we're just trying to fight for our lives and our right to exist just like everybody else. I suggest that, on the other hand, cisgenderism is an ideology. And it's an ideology that is being increasingly upheld within, systems through organizational violence. And what do I mean by organizational violence? Such as we're seeing, an increasing number of legislation that wants to punish people, for example, for using a public bathroom that doesn't align with their documentation, which is dictated by their gender assigned at birth, that some doctor decided on the basis of the visible genitalia, which we're already seeing is kind of problematic for a lot of different reasons, right? So there's legislation that has been not just introduced, but passed in many states and in other countries too, punishing people for using the wrong, in air quotes, public bathroom, or arresting parents and caregivers who want to support their children to be who they are and want to support the well-being of their children by validating whoever they are in terms of gender, or criminalizing healthcare providers for just doing our job as as a behavioral health provider when I'm providing gender affirming care. And if you're not sure what gender affirming care is, there's a whole episode that I've done with Dr. Colton Shaneke about gender affirming care for gender stories. But we're seeing also legislation that is attempting to criminalize healthcare providers, whether it's behavioral health providers like myself or colleagues who are medical health care providers, for just doing our job and following research evidence and international guidelines and standards of care that numerous researchers, scholars, and healthcare providers with decades of experience in the field have poured hundreds of hours into creating, usually as part of volunteer efforts and as a service to the profession as well as a service to society. And so I would say that cisgenderism is an ideology because it's trying to really uphold a set of beliefs through very restrictive and violent and carceral ways of maintaining it. And quite frankly, if cisgenderism was the natural, in air quotes, state as well, would it take so much legislation and so much punishment to uphold it? If you never ask yourself that, just ask yourself that for a moment while I sip my water. If cisgenderism was so natural, what's the problem? Why do we even need all this legislation and all this punishment around it, right? Why do we need to all these laws and practices to enforce it, reproduce it, and protect it, right? We should need to, if this is a natural, in air quotes, state of being. So, I don't know. Just ask yourself some questions if you haven't asked yourself those questions, right? Finally, when we're talking about cisgenderism, even though, like I said, trans feminine folks, and especially trans feminine folks, so folks who are assigned male at birth, that identify somewhere away from male. So they might identify as trans women or women of trans experience or just as women or as femmes or non-binary femmes and so on. Trans feminine people or black, brown, immigrant, disabled, indigenous are much more likely to bear the impact and the violence of cisgenderism, and we can see that in the higher rates of violence and murder. That doesn't mean that other gender identities are not impacted, right? In fact, another thing that I talk about in my book, look at me lifting up the book 3 times in one episode. Maybe I'm overdoing it. But anyway, one of the things that I talk about is the fact that cisgenderism hurts everybody. And there are so many examples of how cisgenderism hurts everybody. We've seen some of those examples in the news as people are trying to enact those very restrictive laws about who can use which bathroom. We have seen people who are cisgender, so whose gender assigned at birth aligns with their gender identity, being challenged in bathrooms, feeling, and this includes like young people, minors are being bullied by adults to prove their gender, in air quotes, right? Minors are who want to just play sports, are being asked to prove, in air quote, that they are the gender they say they are. And often that means, those children basically being told to like reveal parts of themselves, like their chest or their genitals, to full-grown adults. Isn't that abusive? I think that's abuse. To me, that's pretty clear that that's an abuse of power, right? And so when we're talking about cisgenderism, we're not just talking about trans people getting harmed. Really, everyone is harmed by cisgenderism, from people who don't comply to standards of gender for whatever reason, being challenged in bathrooms to prove that they are the gender that they are, as well as athletes, especially black women athletes, being challenged to prove again that they are the gender that they say they are. And that's where that kind of racism, anti-blackness, misogyny, misogynoir all come together, right? And again, we see examples of that pretty much at every Olympic game, I feel. And so, and even, those are larger examples, and of course there are more extreme examples of violence. But even in our everyday life, when I talk to people about gender, there are so many cis people who carry so much gender pain about even simple things like which toys they were allowed to play or not play with, which clothes they were allowed to wear or not wear at home or at school. Or a church or at places of worship, right? Which friends they were allowed to hang out or not hang out with, which sports they were allowed to play, which books they were allowed to read or not read. So like I said, this is not just about trans people. This is about all of us. This is about our freedom, if you care about freedom. Our freedom to be ourselves, our freedom to express ourselves, our freedom to fully embody who we are, no matter what our gender identity is. That's what we are talking about, instead of having to constrict ourselves into those tiny gender roles, gender boxes that may or may not suit us, regardless of what our gender identity is, right? And, there are some very real inequalities that are based on gender and race in particular, as well as other factors, of course, in healthcare and education, to name just a couple of domains. But again, those inequalities when it comes to gender and race, just to name 2 variables, are not inherent to biological facts. They are a byproduct of social and cultural norms, biases, prejudices, and structural and historical oppression. And that's what we really need to tackle if we want to live in a more liberated world, right? And like I said, cisgenderism really does hurt everybody including cis white man, including even cis white straight man, even cis white straight Christian man, which seem to be able-bodied cis white straight Christian man, right? We should be at the top of the mountain in terms of power and privilege in the so-called US. They are also hurt by cisgenderism. And there is so much to be said about this, but again, I am trying my best to be more concise. Let me know how I'm doing in the comments or by contacting me directly. And if you don't want to read a bunch of peer-reviewed papers or books or book chapter, have a look at things like the TV series with DC comic book character Peacemaker, for example. Peacemaker season 1 really explore issues around masculinity and white masculinity in particular, and the trauma that can come from rigid gender binaries, not just individually, but in terms of intergenerational trauma and the pain that comes from upholding those kind of binaries. And the little content note, if you have not seen Peacemaker, that it is very violent, and there are lots of kind of racist and misogynistic comments being made. But I've watched it recently, and I was really surprised at actually what an interesting take it is on the intersection of toxic masculinity and white supremacy. It was, it's both a show that is ridiculous and profound at the same time. I don't know how they managed it, but they managed it. If you watched it or if you have ideas, let me know what you think. I'd love to know what you think. I think that popular culture often really is a reflection, right, of dominant culture, but it can also help us rethink messages in dominant culture. And I think that Peacemaker does that pretty well when it comes to that intersection of toxic masculinity and white supremacy. But again, content note for very graphic violence and also for racism and misogyny being sprinkled all throughout the show, and probably other issues as well. So that is a lot to digest and a little bit longer than I expected this episode to be. Sorry about that. But apparently I had a lot to say about that. So if you want to learn more about all of this, there's a few resources and references in the episode description. But I want to end this episode with actually doing something that it's a little bit different, which is reading the very last couple of pages on my book, Gender Trauma, which really talk about kind of envisioning new possibilities beyond a cisgenderist ideology. What is, though, a decolonial understanding of gender? We cannot bathe in the same river twice. I don't believe that we can go back to a mythical pre-colonial past. We cannot erase history, trauma, and just pretend it never happened when it's still happening. As a trauma therapist, I witness these desires on an individual basis almost daily. So many of my clients wish to just forget, pretend whatever painful thing happened did not happen, or think that eradicating the perpetrator in some way might bring them peace. However, when there's been a wound, the wound needs to be tended to. It needs to be noticed, cleaned up, and treated, and it takes time to heal. What would a pre-colonial past even look like for many of us who were involuntarily or voluntarily displaced in a number of ways, including due to gendered violence? I think that comfort and connection can be found in the past, but I am not sure that our future can be found there. I've written elsewhere that to think about the future directions of non-binary genders is science fiction, and a number of much better authors than I have engaged and continue to engage in those questions. I do know that healing from gender trauma is a landscape that I do not know if we can even begin to imagine. However, it is a critical feeling of a possibility that has not come to be yet. I sense into it when I'm around other people who actively challenge normative ideas of gender in favor of authenticity, no matter what their own gender identities and experiences might be. I taste it when I'm in communities where consent, healing, and relationships are at the center, the heart of what we're doing. I smell it in the wind of younger generations who often no longer think like us when it comes to gender, but are still shaped and impacted by our trauma. I believe the healing from gender trauma lives in the spaces between us, the spaces across which we try to reach for one another when we dream of community, when we create structures centered around healing, justice, and liberation, when we strive for disability justice and access, when we dare to envision truly radically inclusive spaces. There is no definitive answer here, no listicle I can give you or magic formula for how to fix the painful impact of this historical, cultural, intergenerational, and social trauma of cisgenderism, of a rigid gender binary. However, I believe that if we can start to notice the wound, engage with it critically, start to clean it up within and between ourselves, we can start to plant seeds for another world of possibilities. This is a world in which we are connected to the past, where we do not deny or erase our history, but we do not get stuck with it either. Rather, we move forward, reclaiming what is ours and creating anew what was destroyed. This book is a long, open-handed invitation to this dream of gender liberation for our collective healing. How will you respond? And I guess that this is the question I want to leave you with today as well. This video is another invitation to really challenge everything we've been taught and that we think we know about gender, and see if there are more expansive possibilities when we approach this with curiosity and critical thinking. And until we meet again, keep breathing as deeply as you're able. Take good and gentle care, and ciao e alla prossima.